Australia is mostly celebrated for its prosperity, but the system is failing. Over the past years, there has been growing public concern around housing affordability. Many people have voiced their frustration, calling for reforms to eliminate negative gearing and change the capital gains tax discount on investment properties, and on a gut level, that seems to make sense. But we wanted to look at the whole picture, so we went into the archives and I pulled up some of the most interesting statistics, and I found a lot of really eye-opening things. To understand the long-term trend, it's important that we start by understanding how the housing market took shape. Something's gone wrong, and we're about to find out why living in Australia now feels almost impossible. Around the post-World War II period starting in 1946, soldiers were coming back home and the economy was booming. In one of the first examples of how similar Australia is to the United States, this time period was seen as the golden age for many Australians. In this time of growth, the only problem was that there simply weren't enough houses for all these new citizens. In all, Australia suffered a shortage of around 300,000 homes. This affected the productivity and health of the burgeoning workforce, so the government did the responsible thing. The post-war Labor Party-led government worked with their political rivals and came up with a compromise and a solution. This led to the government starting the Post-War Reconstruction Authority, which in turn established the Commonwealth Housing Commission. Both sides actually prioritised the needs of the nation over furthering their political advantage, and the people were better off for it. The government was tasked with a momentous challenge, but they had an idea. They placed the problem under tight supervision and had a building frenzy. Between the late 1940s and the early 1960s, houses were suddenly being built left and right. Financing was designed to help the prospective buyer, and housing costs related realistically to then current wages. The concept of the Australian dream, the idea that the average Australian should be able to work a single job to support his family and own his own home, got started during this time period. It led to a massive building effort that eased the initial shortage. Houses were being built and a focus was placed on home ownership. Over the years, this figure grew substantially. Home ownership had become more common. This was encouraged by the government, amongst other things, with the tax breaks for homeowners mentioned earlier, like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Over that same period, investment property had become a major segment of the housing stock. The transition to widespread home ownership had cost the government billions, and in the late 1990s and 2000s, many felt it was time for politics to become more combative. The collaborative nature of Australian politics that would exist immediately after the post-war period would fall apart as greed and personal benefit began to matter more. As a result, those formerly buyer-friendly laws that favoured the consumer began to gradually turn against them. By the time the year 2000 hit, it was much more beneficial to be the landlord than the tenant in Australia. So in many other countries, housing policy is designed to maintain affordability, whereas in Australia, housing has become almost entirely driven by investment. So how did it go wrong? Housing was historically considered a social good, but it became a tool for building wealth, like those tax breaks for investors. They were originally conceived to encourage people to buy a home, and they ended up creating a wealth disparity. The already hugely expensive negative gearing allows one to deduct expenses and losses from rental properties from their taxable income. Along with this, the capital gains tax discount means that if you buy an asset, hold it for 12 months, and then sell it, you only pay tax on half of the profit that you made. This is great if you own your house, but here's the problem. You got a major tax break, but your neighbour who rents a similar house didn't get any of that. In other words, the system drives inequality between people who own and people who rent. The top 1% of earners own 25% of all homes. In 2020 to 2021, the top 10% received nearly $13 billion in benefits from the tax expenditures, more than the bottom 90% combined. The problem continued to worsen because the two biggest parties began a pattern of kicking the problem down the road for the next guys to have to deal with that would repeat for decades. These alternating approaches would neutralize progress while the housing crisis was only going to worsen with each policy reversal. More cracks started to show, specifically due to the concentration of the population. 5 main metropolitan areas, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth and Adelaide, contain a population of over 1 million each, and altogether add up to approximately 62% of the entire country's population. With 90% of the population living in urban areas, Australia is in fact the third least densely populated country in the world. This high population concentration means that vast chunks of the available homes in these cities have been purchased by companies that then rent them out as Airbnbs, which the Aussies refer to as holiday homes. They drive up housing prices like crazy in major metropolitan areas. Despite government measures, home ownership rates flatlined and housing supply stagnated. The rise of NIMBY, not in my backyard, movements made it even harder to build new developments, as residents protested projects that could expand housing. This resistance strangled infrastructure growth and limited options nationwide. The consequences are so brutal that Sydney is now the second least affordable city in the world. Housing prices have surged 39.1% in 5 years, and the average earner, around 67,000 Australian dollars per year, can afford just 14% of homes on the market. Between 2012 and 2022, housing costs nearly doubled with a 20% jump in just 1 year. In 2023, immigration numbers reached over 500,000, sparking debate about its role in the crisis. While immigration is a factor for the crisis, in comparison to the actual policy issues as well as designs within the country of Australia, this is not as big of a factor as those. The continuous amounts of information, misinformation, and high feelings about the immigration issue would lead to the March for Australia, which took place on August 31, 2025. Police would estimate that the turnout was somewhere between 50,000 and 55,000 people. In the end, it all comes down to supply. Unless the government builds more homes, like it once did, the Australian dream will keep slipping further into a dystopian nightmare. Do you think Australia can ever bring back the dream of affordable home ownership? Or is it gone for good? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.